Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center's monthly series In Conversation with a Survivor. Today, we are honored to have Peter Hajnal tell his story of his survival of the Holocaust. My name is Elise Herskovitz, and I am the programs lead at Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center. And I'm proud to be joined today by Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center senior educator Elena Kingsbury, who will be interviewing Peter today. So I'll hand it over to you, Elena.
Thank you as always, Elise, and welcome back, everybody. I know we never really left, but September is always a significant time for education at FSWC, and we are so excited for the fall ahead and what the year is going to bring. We have some incredible speakers lined up for conversations throughout the year, and tonight's brilliant guest is Peter Hajnal. Peter, I do want to extend a very warm welcome to you and thank you in advance for sharing details about your personal and professional life, as well as any additional wisdom you can provide us with along the way. So we'll begin momentarily, but I just want to introduce some key points about your story of survival and post-war life for our audience. So Peter Hajnal was born in Budapest, Hungary in 1936, where he lived through Nazi Germany's occupation of Hungary, the Hungarian fascist takeover of the country's government, the ghetto, and finally a children's shelter in Budapest run by Hungarian Nazi sympathizers. He came to Canada in early 1957 as a Hungarian refugee after the defeat of the 1956 uprising. He lives in Toronto and is a retired librarian and professor from the University of Toronto. As well, he worked at the United Nations in New York for 10 years. He has published extensively about international relations and organizations, has authored and edited 11 books, and wrote a number of journal articles. Most recently, his book in its second revised edition, the G20 Evolution into Relationships Documentation. So Peter, it is truly an honor to speak with you today. Welcome to the program. So let's begin. As I just mentioned to your audience, you were born in 1936. So can you just start off by laying out for us a little bit about what you remember about life for you and your family before the war?
Okay, to start with, let me mention that this is not an easy task for me, as you can imagine, but it's a necessary one. And I'm doing it. And I want to thank the Friends of Wiesenthal Center, especially for Alice and Elena, for facilitating this conversation. Well, before World War II, I lived in a middle-class family in Budapest. My father died in 1942 of heart disease, and I do remember his funeral. I remember that my mother did her best to look after me and my two younger brothers, although one of the two brothers died of an illness earlier. I was a young child, so my memories are rather vague until 1944. We lived near the Dohány Street Synagogue in Budapest, which is a famous building built in the Moorish style. Some of you may have seen it. And we attended services for the high holidays and on some other occasions. And on Friday nights, my mother lit the Shabbat candles and said her prayers. We had the usual Shabbat food. So I was certainly aware of my Jewish identity, which was part of your question, Elena. I had much more vivid recollections of Nazi persecution and anti-Semitism starting in 1944, especially after the German occupation and the Hungarian Nazi takeover of the government in October of that year. I was indeed exposed to the worst manifestations of anti-Semitism during that period.
And could you maybe share with us a little bit about what happened to your family after the occupation in 1944?
Yes. Well, let me start with two comments. Okay. First of all, Jews in Budapest were quite assimilated into Hungarian life and culture, much more so than Jews in rural areas or in some other countries, Poland and so forth, in Eastern Europe. At least we thought we were assimilated, but that didn't help once the Nazis took over. Second thing is that the Nazi takeover in Hungary, especially Budapest, came much later in the war, as I said, in the fall of 44. Now, the earlier times of that are not all my memory because I was just too young.
Sure.
But I was told that life was good before the war for us. After Hitler seized power, anti-Semitism flared up in Hungary, and people could sense that the storm was coming.
Right.
Now, things changed drastically in 1944. And here I give a longish answer, if I may.
Please.
Hungary's leader from March 1920 to mid-October 44 was Admiral Miklós Horthy. Hungary was still technically a kingdom following the First World War, so Horthy was regent. And he had the title of admiral, even though Hungary no longer had a sea during his regency.
Right.
Now, many Jews believed that Horthy was not responsible for too many deaths. In fact, he was implicated in the death of almost 600,000 Hungarian Jews, and he sent another 200,000 non-Jewish Hungarians to their deaths. Remember, there were also other victims. Anti-Jewish laws were enacted in the country, for instance, forbidding intermarriage marriage between Jews and non-Jews, excluding Jews from participation in many professions. But Horthy did try to spare the Jews of Budapest until later on. Now, before the Holocaust, Hungary had a Jewish population of over 800,000. Adolf Eichmann came to Budapest to supervise the deportation of Jews, mostly to Auschwitz. So between mid-May and early July 44, over 434 Jews were deported on 147 trains. Most of them, and about 80% of them were gassed on arrival. And the quick deportation was carried out in close cooperation between Hungarian and German Nazis.
Right.
That perhaps will give you a bit of an idea there.
Thank you for that outline. I think that gives everyone, because as you said, the narrative of the Holocaust in Hungary specifically is very unique, and the fate of the Hungarian Jewish population, each country really has its own unique story, but certainly the fate of the Hungarian Jewish community is as disturbing as it is fascinating. And it is also, thank you for sort of complicating. I think sometimes, as you say, people have a sort of rosy picture of Horthy and his, certainly he had many, I'm sure, pressures on him, and there's all kinds of arguments that historians can make, but it's important to acknowledge the deaths that occurred under his leadership as well.
Now, may I tell you a little bit more about my own experience now?
Yes, please. And how old were you in 44 when?
Well, I was between 8 and 9 years old. So I was a child, but I do have some very sharp memories of that period.
So during that period, who were you with? Were you with your mother and brother?
I was with my mother and my youngest brother, Tommy.
Okay.
Now, as many of you know, many buildings were designated as Jewish houses with a large yellow star at the gate indicating that. And all Jews had to wear yellow stars sewn onto their jackets, coats. And I remember store signs that read, "We do not serve Jews." And I remember asking my mother why we had to wear the yellow star and why stores refused to serve us. And she didn't give a clear answer because I suppose she didn't want to cause me more distress. And we didn't go outside any more than necessary, so we wouldn't call attention to ourselves. Now, I'd like to tell you about a couple of episodes of incidents. There was one that had a very deep physical and psychological impact on me. One night when I was sleeping, a Hungarian Nazi officer appeared in our apartment, and he was accompanied by a Catholic priest. One of the two awakened me, I'm not sure which, and by throwing me out of my bed, which is how I woke up, very startled, and I felt my fall, and I landed on the floor, landed hard on the floor. And I was hurt, but the precise details are a bit vague by now.
And you were
Now,
8 or
many
9
years
years old.
later,
I'm so
yeah,
sorry,
yeah.
8. Yeah.
I was just going to say that many years later, when I was an adult, I realized that all religions have the capacity of both good and evil. And I've seen both in my lifetime. Now, after the Nazi takeover, my mother and I were forced to go to the racetrack called Tattersall in the outskirts of Budapest, along with crowds of Jews, where all our valuables, jewelry, and so forth were taken away. And we were kept for about 2 or 3 days, after which we were allowed to go home. And fortunately, my younger brother was able to stay in our apartment with a lady who looked after us. Anyway, we reunited. And in November of 44, my mother and brother were forced to move to the Budapest ghetto. And we lived in very crowded and dangerous conditions, very little food and no freedom, of course. And there were 3-level wooden bunk beds set up in all the rooms of the building. And my mother and I and my brother were in the middle bunk with a straw mattress, and that was it. Now, one day our bunk, which was very shoddily put together, collapsed and injured many people, including me. There were also periodic quote-unquote selections, which meant that the Nazis took some Jews to be sent to concentration camps, usually to their deaths. A ghetto was surrounded by walls and was guarded by Nazis to prevent escape. Now, there was also a smaller international ghetto in another part of Budapest, and that was relatively safer, but not really safe.
And that was for Jewish
For
people
Jewish
from outside of
people,
Budapest?
yes. And there was something called a Schutzpass, that's supposedly a safe passage document. And Switzerland issued almost 8,000 of these. I have the numbers here. Sweden, 4,500. And the Vatican, Portugal, and Spain, over 3,000 combined. Now, the Arrow Cross Guards, the Hungarian sort of gendarmerie, called Nyilas in Hungarian, they raided the ghettos regularly, both ghettos, and there were mass executions. In addition, between November 44 and February 45, the Nyilas shot 10 to 15,000 Jews on the banks of the Danube River. Right. One of my aunts was among those victims. And there are many pairs of shoes that are permanently installed on the shore of the river as a memorial.
It's it's one of the most disturbing and very striking memorials to the Holocaust I've seen.
Yeah. Now, my mother was able somehow to get a Swiss Schutzpass, but it wasn't much use. Didn't help much.
Oh, interesting.
Anyway, she found a children's home for me and my young brother outside the ghetto. And that held the promise of better treatment and better food. And it was run supposedly by the Red Cross. But as you mentioned in your introduction, Elena, it was actually run by Hungarian Nazi sympathizers. So we really lived in terrible conditions, just about starving.
Wow.
Uh,
Peter, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just curious, were the other children in the home Jewish as well, or was it a mix of Jewish and
no,
non-Jewish?
as far as I know, just Jewish.
Okay. Okay.
But I may be wrong. I believe it was only Jewish.
Okay.
Now, as the Red Army was approaching Budapest, the people who oversaw the children's shelter fled, and they left us freezing and starving in the basement, which was unheated.
Wow.
So I suffered a 3-degree frostbite on one of my feet, and I couldn't walk. So the first person who found me was my aunt, who somehow got to the building even before the full liberation of Budapest.
Wow.
And she happened to have, I remember, a couple of cubes of ersatz coffee with some sugar in it. And she brought me some water, so that may have saved my life.
Wow.
And then the next day, my mother came with a baby carriage because I couldn't walk and took me home. And our family doctor who examined me, also a Jewish survivor, said that my left foot would probably have to be amputated. But as it happened, that was not necessary, fortunately.
Oh, thank goodness.
Now, on the Buddha side of the capital,
Yes.
that was liberated later, until almost the middle of February.
Okay.
And I have to say that I saw many German soldiers and tanks and so forth during that period, but to my recollection, it was Hungarian Nazis and their sympathizers who perpetrated most of the atrocities.
Hmm.
That was my personal impression. So that is my long answer to your question.
An excellent answer, and my wheels are spinning now, but I'll try to stay on track. So one of the questions that I know I posed to you is, what do you think? If I know there's maybe many answers, but what would you say you owe your survival to?
Well, this is will be a short answer, I think.
Okay.
It's a difficult question. I would say luck, if you can speak about luck in this context, determination, a will to live, perhaps, and I would say the love and care of my mother and aunt.
That's beautiful, and that is something a lot of the survivors I've spoken with have made similar comments about the love that has helped.
Yes.
Especially when we're talking about young children and the fate of children in this period, we know that
Yeah.
so many Jewish children did not survive. So you were already sharing with us a little bit, Peter, about your experience of liberation. So maybe we can talk as well a little bit about, you were a young child and you just shared a little bit of, witnessing atrocities committed by Hungarian sympathizers, for instance. So do you remember your feelings from that time, or as a young child, how did that post-war period feel for you? And what was it like for your family members, and, kind of the trauma that, as a family people had gone through? Was that reunification an easy process?
Well, how did I feel? You mean on during liberation or afterwards?
Right, yeah. Or if you
Well,
remember some of the, you know, your strongest
I
memories from.
felt, first of all, I felt safe
Good.
after all what happened.
Yeah.
I felt grateful to the, in this case, to the Soviet soldiers who liberated Budapest,
Sure.
and I hoped that you know, life will be better and healthier and safer.
Absolutely. And that's, you know, I think especially, so you were about 10 years old in
No,
1940?
not quite 9, between 8
Oh,
and 9.
wow. Okay, so you were, okay, yeah. So that, so you're at an age where you're still really, I would say, you know, maybe some of that youthful resilience and optimism helps deal with these situations and, you know, picking up the pieces in the aftermath.
Perhaps, yes.
Perhaps, maybe
Yeah,
that's
yeah, resilience would be
speculation.
part of it. Yeah.
Sure. So, and what could you share a little bit about what was life like for your family members after the war? And, you know, for you as a student in Soviet Hungary, what are your
Yes.
impressions from that time?
Well, let me first go back to right after liberation. Uh, in My mother was able to find a store window. There are many store windows along the streets of Budapest which had been broken,
Mm,
and a lot of little entrepreneurs set up shops in these broken store windows. So my mother, you know, they sold different staple merchandise. My mother opened a small haberdashery shop in one of these. Uh, Now, very soon, toward the end of 1945, we moved down to the town of Gyöngyös, about 80 kilometers from Budapest. First to the house of my uncle, who had lived in Gyöngyös before the war, and was able to return after being in a forced labor camp and concentration camp also. And then later on, we moved to a different place. And I have a little episode which is a bit of in a lighter vein. It was both funny and sad in a way. The next door, in the next house, there was a Soviet officer and his wife, and they set up their quarters there. And one day they had a very heated argument between the two. And the wife was working with some dough to make bread. And in the argument, the husband threw the dough over the fence into our yard. So my mother picked it up and cleaned it and baked the delicious loaf of bread, which is a real treat.
that's so funny. That's, I guess there was no residual anger baked into the bread. That's
I
hopefully not.
suppose, yes.
That's a great story.
Now, uh, is this the place where I can say a little bit about some of my family, some of my relatives?
Please, that would be wonderful if you could share a little bit
I
about
could share a couple
the
of
faith.
things,
Yeah.
and these are, there's nothing lighthearted about this. First of all, one of my aunts, Aunt Elizabeth, had 4 children. They were in the ghetto under very, very difficult circumstances. And my aunt gave the last bit of her food to her children. As a result, she literally starved to death. The children survived and eventually made their way to Israel, and that's a whole other adventure. Uh, one of my cousins was on the ship Hatikva, which was intercepted by trying to sail to Palestine, which is under British mandate still, so mandatory Palestine, on the ship. But the British attacked the ship in the middle of the Mediterranean, and and then forced it to go back to Europe. And in her case, it was to Cyprus, but she had to wait more than a year until uh, Israel was established. So she was able to go. And her sister, a bit younger, uh, was actually on the Exodus. And many of you may have seen or read the Leon Uris book or the film based on it, on the Exodus. So you know the basic story. And that was a horrific voyage. That's a ship that was designed for 400 passengers, and there were 4,500 Jews jammed into it.
Mm.
And it was intercepted again and attacked by the British Navy. It was machine gun, rammed, stormed by sailors, and disabled. So the Jews put up quite a defense, but the captain and two passengers were killed, and then there were many wounded. The ship was towed into Haifa, and desperate refugees were swarming onto the dock. But the British sent the seriously wounded people to a hospital and rounded up the rest. And eventually, the British took them back to Germany, of all places, where they were placed in a displaced persons camp. And again, after the establishment of Israel, the sister was also able to go there. And the other two children who were even younger, the two boys, also could be there. And eventually they were reunited.
Wow.
So
That's quite the
that, yes.
quite the ordeal, and very interesting that you're and they're sisters, you said, that were on either ship. Is that correct?
My cousins,
Oh, cousins. Okay.
my aunt's, my aunt's children.
Yes.
The oldest one, Rachel, was 16, and the youngest one was probably about 10.
Wow. Okay. And meanwhile, you are back in Hungary in this time, correct? And
Yes.
one of the questions I was just curious, and as a student, you may not have been as focused on this, but do you have memories of anti-Semitism in post-war Hungary?
Yes, but
Yeah.
nothing too open. Nothing too open.
Okay.
Remember, the Russians were enemies of the Nazis. Well,
Absolutely.
not always. You remember, there was a infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop pact. But anyway, they were
Right.
attacked by the Nazis. You know the story. Um, so so
So it
there
was
was
not open.
not too much open anti-Semitism, but it was definitely there. And when I was going to school, elementary school, I remember several anti-Semitic incidents and discrimination and so forth, and
Mm.
rather thoughtless and cruel comments and so forth.
From other students or from
Uh,
staff?
from other students mostly,
Right.
being called Christ killer and all of the usual tropes.
Right. Of
Uh,
course.
and the teacher was silent, neither approved nor disapproved.
Mm.
That's elementary school. Later in secondary school, which was mostly in Budapest, because we returned to Budapest, I didn't really experience open anti-Semitism.
Okay. Good. Um, and so you remained in Hungary up until the revolution and even beyond. So what was your experience like during the Hungarian uprising of 56 and
Well,
your
I was a university student by then in Budapest,
yeah, okay.
and I remember very well the beginning, the October, the revolution, when we started with a large demonstration in Parliament Square, which was quite peaceful and quite hopeful. And I certainly sympathized. I wasn't terribly active, but I sympathized with what was happening. And later on, revolutions can be beautiful in some ways, but it can become ugly. And I saw some very ugly scenes, such as a Russian soldier in a tank that was burned, and his body was his charred body was still there. And I also saw an officer of the Hungarian secret police, and they were really hated. But this man was hanged, and was hanging upside down with a bunch of banknotes stuffed into his mouth. I also remember some book burning and so forth. So there's a point during the revolution where there was a parting of the ways, I should say.
To put it mildly, okay. No,
Yeah.
that's
So in '56,
yeah.
late '56, I left, fled across the border, which was an adventure in itself, and
Into Austria?
into Austria.
Yeah.
Not easily. I was always a bit of a procrastinator, and there was a little window of opportunity which I missed. So this is a bit later.
Okay.
So, but we made our way with some difficulty, and arrived in Austria after some very unfortunate adventures. Yeah, we were being shot at by that time by the border guards,
Wow.
but they were Hungarian border guards, and their heart wasn't in it. So first they shot to miss. But anyway, it was scary.
To be shot at, nonetheless, I think would be pretty terrifying.
There it was.
Yeah, absolutely. And you say you were with your mother
Oh,
with
no,
or
no, not with my mother. I
okay.
left by myself. I was 20.
Okay. Okay.
Uh,
Wow.
and But my mother encouraged me, hoping, for a better life and
Okay.
so
Yeah.
forth.
So you were with a group of other people
A
escaping.
small group of other people,
Right.
and we ended up in Austria, and we were received by a charitable group. I can't quite really put my finger on the name of it now, but
Sure.
and we were housed. Our particular group, mostly students, we were housed in a former castle
Wow.
near the Vienna airport, which was turned into a dormitory and run by the Dutch.
Oh,
So we stayed there for about almost 6 months. No, not quite 6 months. I would say 4.5, 5 months.
okay.
And then there was a choice of various countries to go to, and I chose Canada.
Wonderful.
Partly because of the reputation of the country as being a peaceful, democratic uh, place, good opportunities, and at that point I wanted to go as far away from Europe as possible. And there are others in that situation, that frame of mind. So, so it was May 1957 when I arrived in Montreal.
Wow. And when you arrived, you were living in Montreal? Did you start going back to school? Were you working? What was life like when you
Well, I
in the early
started to
years?
work, and at first it had to be, a couple of very menial jobs, but any job was necessary. We got a bit of pocket money from the Canadian government, but not enough to live on.
Mm,
So I found two or three jobs, and different jobs, one after the other, because they were not exactly stable or ideal jobs, but they were jobs. They brought in a bit of money, and the last of these was actually in Montreal in the Jewish General Hospital. But when I was operating an elevator, and at that time I had to announce each floor in English and French. And anyway,
one of those jobs that has perhaps gone extinct in a way, but that's a wonderful image. Did you have a uniform as well?
I think I had a cap.
Okay.
But always I wore my own clothes. My plan was to continue to go to university, continue my studies, but I had quite a major health setback, which put me back by about a year and a half. So I wasn't immediately going back to university. And when I was able to work again, I found better jobs, but I actually became a part-time student at what was then called Sir George Williams University, which became part of Concordia later in Montreal. I did it part-time, and then a job opportunity came up at the UN in New York, which I took. So I moved on to New York, 1962, and took that job in the library of the United Nations, the Dag Hammarskjöld Library.
Wow.
And there I was exposed to international institutions, especially the UN, and the documentation and information policies and so on and so forth. So that was really a formative experience for me in terms of future research priorities and that kind of thing. Now, I wasn't at that point qualified as a professional librarian, but I continued my part-time studies first at the New School for Social Research in New York, and then finally got my master's degree at Columbia University in 1968. Now, because of the UN bureaucracy, I wasn't able to re-qualify as a professional. So then an offer came up from the University of Toronto as a professional librarian. So I came back in 1968, to work at the U of T. But I still had my eye on the UN, and a few years later, I could go back as a professional to the UN library, working with documentation and other information sources, and doing all kinds of interesting things that New York had to offer, theater and music, and made some friends. And I should say something important. In 1968, still in Toronto, I met my wife. So when I went back to New York, she came with me, and our son was born. And I think my son is in the virtual audience.
Wonderful.
But he was born there in 1972, and that brought great joy, great changes to our lives.
I'm sure.
So that part of the reason we came back to Toronto was that there's a lot of turmoil in New York by that time, and all the good things that it had to offer, there were some uncertainties, and we thought it'd be a more secure, more steady kind of life back here. So we came back then to Toronto, where I worked at the U of T library, and later on I also taught at the Faculty of Information, it's called now, had a different name.
Okay, right. It used to be called Library Sciences, I believe, and now so you were
Library and Information Studies and Sciences.
Okay.
And then the administration, in its wisdom, decided to take the L out of librarianship. Anyway, it eventually became a Faculty of Information, period.
Okay.
which everybody mistakes for computer sciences. It's not.
Okay, I guess I can see how people would get confused, but I guess it's pure information, not information
Yeah.
systems or whatever they want to
No,
call.
no information. And what I thought was, first of all, I inherited a course in government documentation from a very prominent Canadian librarian, and I continued that and developed it further. And then I always wanted to find a bridge between documentation information on the one hand and international relations on the other hand. So I started and developed and started a course in international documentation, which I
Mm,
think was the first such course, at least in North America. There were a couple of others afterwards, not many. So
wow.
that I enjoyed very much. And I also enjoyed very much my um, job, especially for the 10-year period when I was head of government documents in the U of T library.
Wow. And as a, someone who believes so strongly in the importance of documentation and, coming from a historical perspective, of course, but I think, your work is fascinating and so valuable. And thank you for sharing a little bit about that with us. And I know you also have a number of publications. You're an author, correct?
Uh,
So
that is correct.
yeah,
How are we doing this time here?
we have about 17 minutes left by my
Okay, so
estimation, but we can take a little bit. Yeah,
yeah,
I
let me
see
go
a lot
back.
of amazing questions coming in from the audience as well. So we'll save a
Okay,
minute or two
okay.
for
Let
those.
me go back a minute and say
Sure.
that in addition to teaching at the Faculty of Information, I did some guest teaching in the field of international relations, and this is for
Mm,
the Department of Political Science at the U of T. These were guest talks,
right.
invited guest talks, which I enjoyed very much. It was mostly a seminar, uh, uh, last top year undergraduate and graduate seminar in global governance. So that was quite enjoyable too.
Absolutely. That sounds like it would be very, again, as you say, you're sort of you're able to fuse your two passions in a way through that topic.
Yes.
Um, yeah, no, thank you so much. And I think this also very naturally leads into my next question, and I'm mindful of our time for audience questions as well. But I just wanted to also ask you, uh, well, two questions. So first of all, what do you think threatens libraries today? Which I know is sort of it's a side question in a way, but I do, as an expert in your field, I would love to hear a little bit about your insight into the importance of libraries just as community spaces.
Well, it's community spaces, and it's now much more than books.
Mm,
There are
right.
various other media. Uh, Training is involved, both staff training and training of library users.
Mm,
Uh, I would say other educational programs, uh, being an intermediary between electronic information of all kinds from different sources, and being an intermediary to help uh, library patrons uh, log on, not log on, but to connect with the kind of information in a way that corresponds to their specific needs and so forth. So the role of technology has increased greatly, but the book
hmm.
is still very important.
Absolutely. That's at the
Especially when
core.
I think of part of the U of T library system is a wonderful Fisher Rare Book Library, which,
Mm.
by the way, has a terrific Judaica Hebraica collection, as
Cool.
well as some ancient manuscripts, um, and I think the oldest item there is a I think it's on the papyrus. It's an ancient Egyptian
Wow. That's
thing.
an amazing collection.
Describing a commercial transaction, I think it was.
Wow.
Anyway, all the way up to a great collection of on diabetes research. You know, the papers of Banting and Best are there. The papers of Margaret Atwood are there. Just to give you a bit of an indication of the breadth and scope.
That's so interesting. I would love to. You
Very,
probably have to make a special appointment to view documents there, but I think that sounds like a really, really amazing collection.
yes.
So Peter, just because I'm gonna turn us over in a moment to our audience questions, but the last question, and then maybe I'll come back to my last few questions if we have a couple of minutes. But you mentioned that this is, it's difficult for anyone, I think, to share their memories from this time, no matter if they've done it 1,000 times. But this is your first time really speaking publicly about your survival in the Holocaust, and I just want to
Yes.
first of all say thank you. And that's, it takes incredible courage to do so. And I recognize that. And I know everyone else on the call does as well. So why do you want to start speaking now? And why do you think it's important to do so?
Well, first of all, I'm conscious of my age. I'm 88, and I don't know how much time I have left. I hope I have a few years. And there are not too many of us survivors who are still alive. And I think there is a duty to convey this, what happened, so that people can be aware and do their best to prevent the next Holocaust. And another reason is that there is an alarming resurgence of anti-Semitism globally, including here in Canada, as we know.
Absolutely.
So, and you remember the slogan, "Never again," but it happened again and again. If you think of Cambodia, Rwanda, Sudan, Myanmar, you name it.
Absolutely.
So we have to be conscious of it and alert.
We do. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I know that, for all of us here on the call, you sharing your memories does help us build that defense against repeating the crimes of the past.
Yes.
So I'm just going to look through. We have a few incredible questions here. So from Ronnie, the question, Ronnie Hajnal, so probably someone you're familiar with. What is the name of the synagogue that you attended in Budapest? I know it's
the Dohany Street, Dohany.
Yes.
And it's a beautiful synagogue.
It is.
It's not just a place of worship, but also it has a cemetery, a martyr's cemetery. It has a wonderful artificial weeping willow tree with silver leaves, each leaf commemorating a particular person who perished in the Holocaust. And I actually arranged for one leaf for my maternal grandmother, about whom there's nothing else too much that's available. About the others, I actually sent in testimonies to Yad Vashem in Jerusalem for at least 12 of my very close relatives who perished.
Wow. So even though you haven't always spoken about the documentation and your sort of interest in preserving that history has always been there.
Yes. So that's the Dohany Synagogue. It's also, oddly enough, it became a tourist attraction because it's a wonderful building architecturally. So there are crowds of tourists usually who don't go inside, but admire the building from the outside. And it's still very active. There are regular services. they have a wonderful organ and they have their great concerts there. So
Wow.
it's definitely a place if you visit Budapest to include this.
I visited the city a couple of years ago, and I went and did a tour of the synagogue, and I highly recommend it to anyone. It was a very moving experience to go there.
Yes.
So another great question here from David Grossman. Peter, have you been back to Hungary since 1957, 56?
Yes, I made several visits, including a couple of them with my wife, and at least one with my son. Now, my mother died in 1973, and I still had some relatives, nobody very close anymore. So I visited a few more times. I think 2008 was the last time I visited. And frankly, because of the awful system under Viktor Orban right now,
Yeah,
and the fact that I have very little contacts anymore, I have not gone back since then.
understandable. Well, a lot of amazing questions here, so I'm just gonna keep. So one lighter question: what kind of bread was it that the dough that was thrown over the fence and ended up in your oven?
Well, it was probably some kind of a simple bread. It wasn't a multigrain loaf.
Okay, just whatever it was that was in the kitchen,
But
the flour.
it tasted very good.
I'm sure it was amazing.
There was another little incident, if I have 1 minute.
Please.
When we were still in the apartment just after liberation, uh, food was in very short supply. And there was another family, Jewish family, living in the apartment then. And a horse died in the street outside of our building. And there were quite a few people who went down, including the man of the family who lived with us then. And he went down with a knife and carved out a piece from the horse. And my mother cooked it over newspapers because there's no other fuel for the stove.
Mm. How did that taste?
It filled our bellies.
Fair enough.
Yeah,
Diplomatic.
it tasted okay, but it wasn't a gourmet meal.
No, well, the horse probably wasn't eating like a king before the end
No,
either.
no, it was not a sturdy horse.
No. Okay, thank you. Okay, and so another, I think, sort of a much more serious question, but I think very, very relevant. With what's going on in the world today and watching the renewal of anti-Semitism, for you, does that make you feel personally afraid, or how do you feel living in Canada today?
Well, it's a mixture. I live in a retirement home, so in a way, I'm in a bubble. So I haven't personally seen demonstrations and the encampments and so forth, but I watch and read the news, so I'm very very aware, and I'm distressed, of course, but I'm not surprised, I have to say.
Mm,
And I do have some family members who have seen these things close by, and I have a niece who works at the U of T, and during the occupation, she had to accompany a Jewish faculty member who wasn't feeling safe going home from campus.
that's horrible. Unfortunate to hear that that's happening here in Canada.
Yes.
So just moving on to another, I think a fascinating question from Chris Probst. Hungary was one of the countries where the Iron Curtain first fell. Can you give us a little insight into what it felt like to watch, what happened in Hungary from Canada? So once you had moved to Canada and you're, I guess, looking back at what's going on in Hungary, how did that feel?
Well, I had a closer view than that. We happened to be visiting Budapest with my with my wife and son in 1989, which is
Wow.
the year that the Iron Curtain fell.
Right.
So we were in Budapest when the border was a little bit open. There were refugees in Hungary from East Germany, and they were allowed to cross the border. So that was one of the precise sign of what was happening.
Hmm.
And of course, Prime Minister Imre Nagy, who was leader of the revolution in many ways, was captured and went through a mock trial and executed afterwards. That was still in Hungary under the Kádár regime.
Okay.
So there were some distressing things there. Uh, well, and then soon after that, of course, the Iron Curtain fell.
Yeah. And that
And
must have been there. So it's striking me that you were there for the revolution in 56 and also there in 89. So there's a certain, I guess, I don't know. I don't know what I would call that, but it seems significant that you were there in both years.
it was an interesting coincidence.
Yeah. Now, I have a very interesting comment here. Um, so, Peter, my name is Robert Auerstock or Hauerstock. We were roommates at Mount Sinai Sanatorium in 1957. I am very happy to see how well you have done in your career. Um, and I have a question. The question is, what is your major impression of your Canadian immigrant experience?
That's a complicated question. Then or now? When I came, it was still in the midst of the Cold War, so
Mm,
it was politically expedient for the Canadian government to accommodate Hungarian refugees. There's more to it than that. They were willing to accept lots of refugees, but we were treated a lot better than many of the refugees who came much later, as
okay.
including and I've worked as a volunteer with refugees for quite a few years, and I met people. Somebody who was from Sri Lanka, is a Tamil, and he was on that famous ship, I think it's called the Ocean Lady, if I remember correctly. It
Mm,
landed in Vancouver, and they were all considered terrorists by the Canadian government,
right.
um, and detained for several months. Now, my friend was among them, who was a journalist, and I can tell you that he was not a terrorist. Anyway, he came, and eventually they made their lives, but it's with great difficulty. I also
Mm,
knew a Hungarian Roma family, and I worked with them for many years. And remember, the Roma were also victims of the Nazis. They were in
yes,
Auschwitz, and many people were in Auschwitz from different groups, but it was only the Jews and the Roma who were singled out for complete extermination.
very
And
important.
yes, we know more about ourselves, the Jews, because we are the people of the book. The
Yeah.
Roma have more of an oral culture,
Mm,
and we know quite a bit, but not nearly as much. So anyway, this um, this family, they were threatened, physically threatened in Hungary and attacked and so forth. They escaped to Canada. They had a great deal of difficulty. They were living in a church basement for many years, and uh, and then they were deported back to Hungary because the that was during the Harper government, because they were not believed. Their story was not believed.
mm,
Uh, but eventually, a lot of us worked very hard, and with help from legal aid and so forth, and various church groups. That's the good that churches can do, and
Good
synagogues,
organizers.
and synagogues,
Yes.
and so forth. Anyway, we exerted enough pressure that finally the minister, when the liberal government came in, gave a what is it called, a humanitarian and compassionate permission for the family to come back. So
Wow.
they've been back for a number of years now. So that answers in a way your question that the treatment of refugees today is variable.
Thank you. No, and I think you have unique insight into that question. So thank you for sharing that personal story as well as, I think just your knowledge as a person who has worked in that space for many decades. And there are a couple of other questions, but I think that this is perhaps a good place for us to wrap up. Peter, I would love for you to have the last word. Maybe you'd like to share a little bit about, first of all, are there any things that you'd like to share about how you feel for Jewish students or professors on university campuses today? I'll leave it there for now, and then I have one more question.
Okay. Well, I other than what I said, I hope they stick with it.
Yeah.
And I also want to say that it's one thing to be critical of the current Israeli government, and many of us are.
Yeah.
It's another thing to veer into open anti-Semitism when synagogues are firebombed and Jews are physically threatened and not given a chance to even to respond to unwarranted attacks and so forth. So I hope eventually this wave of anti-Semitism will abate a little bit, but we have to hold on until then and continue.
Yes, very good. Thank you. And maybe this is a question that connects, or it could be a completely different direction, but what are the key lessons that you want everyone listening today? What do you want them to take away from Holocaust education, or specifically the conversation that we've been having?
Well, here I anticipate that you would ask this, and I jotted down a few things. So do I have about 2 minutes?
You have any? Yes, you do. Absolutely.
Okay. Well, I would say we have to be familiar with history and the lessons that it teaches. We have to be aware of the human capacity to do good or commit terrible evil also. We have to fight attempts to deny or diminish the Holocaust. Remember, Hitler used to say, "Who remembers the Armenians?"
Yeah.
And well, the Armenians remember the Armenians, and many others do. And we should remember the Holocaust that much more. And we need to oppose anti-Semitism and racism and all kinds of discrimination. We have to speak out. And I actually would like to finish a short quotation by Martin Niemöller. Some of them, you know him. He has this he was a German Lutheran pastor who was dismayed by the silence of German intellectuals in the face of Nazism. And so if you let me, I'll read a short version of what he wrote.
Please do.
And some of you know this. First, they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I didn't speak out because I was not a socialist. And then they came from the trade unionists, and I didn't speak out, etc. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me.
It's
So I'd
such
like
a
to leave,
powerful message.
yeah, I'd like to leave it at that.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Peter. And I think especially for us as Canadians, that is the perfect message to end on. And thank you for everything that you've shared with us today. For our audience, thank you for all of your amazing questions. And if you have any follow-up questions for Peter, please send them to Elise or myself, and we'll make sure that he gets them. Okay? So thank you, everyone, and we wish you a wonderful evening, and we will see you in a month.